very glad to open the third day of this exciting conference. And our first meeting this morning is devoted to the subject of words and deeds. And our first speaker is Emily Michelson. Emily is a senior lecturer in European history at the University of St. Andrews. Her work examines how different religious cultures evolve in response to each other. Her first book, The Pulpit and the Press in Reformation Italy, was published by Harvard University Press in 2013. Her current project, Imaginary Jews in Early Modern Rome, examines the proselytization of Roman Jews as a lens on early modern Catholicism. A related article, Conversionary Preaching and the Jews in Early Modern Rome, appears this month in Past and Present. The project is funded by the British Academy, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the Villa Itati. She is broadly interested in the contributions of religious minorities to the early modern church and city of Rome, and she will speak today on converting the Jews of early modern Rome, new, old, and failed tactics. So please, Emily.
Thank you, Ora, and good morning to all of you. I just want to say again how very pleased I am to be at this conference and how much I've learned from it already. Most of this talk is going to focus on some surprising and compelling notes about Jewish conversion to Catholicism that I found in some manuscripts in the Vatican Library. And these give us an unprecedented insight into the mind and perspectives of a professional converter of Jews. Before I get to them, I'm going to take a step back and give you a broad sense of the context for these notes so that you can see how unusual they are. Early modern Rome in the 16th and 17th century specifically is a city that celebrates its role as the capital of a newly global Catholicism, what Simon Ditchfield has called the first world religion. By the 17th century, this means a city that consciously seeks to project itself as a living model of faith and that celebrates its position as the beacon from which shines forth the light of Catholic piety to every corner of the world. This is a triumphalism that has developed in the face of new enemies in the early modern period, notably Protestantism and the schism of Western religion, and a perceived threat from Turks and Ottomans. What I've just described is, of course, a very one-sided view. It is unidirectional. It is not at all how modern scholars understand Catholicism in this period, but it is very much the sort of rhetoric that is celebrated in the city of Rome at the time. And you see this celebration in all sorts of ways. You see it visually with paintings, such as this famous one in the Gesù, which celebrates the work of Ignatius and Jesuits reaching to 4 continents. We see it architecturally, again, most notably in the example of the new colonnade of St. Peter's embracing the world. You see it also in the cleanup of the city and its many renovation and building projects. And of these, I will point out only one, which is this is the building that houses the Collegio di Propaganda Fide, whose function is to train missionaries from all over the world and send them back out to the world as Catholic missionaries. As a corollary to all of this, uniting global and local initiatives comes a concerted conversionary campaign to the Jews of Rome. The Jews of Rome are the oldest and the least easily ignored Jewish community in Europe. They're the only continuous Jewish community in Europe, and their roots in Rome are deeper than the roots of Christianity itself. So they are also the oldest targets of Christian conversion, subject to methods that have developed over centuries, notably disputations. I realize I'm preaching to a room full of experts in this right now. Not preaching, speaking. Occupational hazard. All right. So there is a long-standing tradition of converting, and techniques for converting Jews, but in light of Rome's changed sense of itself and its sense that it is now in a global spotlight, we have a new conversionary campaign which takes many forms. It includes Events like the Talmud burning of 1553, the foundation of the House of Catechumens in 1543, which you can see here. Well, you can see a related institution, the College of Neophytes. The institution of the Roman Ghetto in 1555, tax breaks for converts, and the development and increase of new literary, printed, anti-Jewish or conversionary polemics. Now, we're well aware after the first day of this conference of all of the multiple audiences and ways of reading polemics like these, but the premise of all of them is the refutation of Judaism and the conversion of Jews to Christianity. At the same time, there is a new scholarly interest in Hebrew, with its roots in Renaissance Christian humanism, which is well established by the 17th century and which is sort of sometimes conversionary. But the showpiece of this entire conversionary campaign, the public face of it, is forced public conversionary preaching to the Jews of Rome. This begins in the late 16th century as a result of these twin drives to establish Rome as the pious heart of a global religion, which leads to anxiety about its native Jewish population. Weekly enforced conversionary preaching was legislated and regulated through two papal bulls in 1577 and 1584. It's supposed to cover a broad, well, most of the country, but I'm particularly interested in how it took place in Rome, where it had an overwhelming symbolic weight and became a popular weekly spectacle. It continues, more or less, weekly through the 18th century. It remains in law until the 19th century. And the audience included the Jews who were compelled to be there, new converts brought in from the Casi di Catecumeni, local Roman Christian residents, and also tourists. So as I said, it is a showpiece of this campaign. Now, into this context, I would like to introduce Gregorio Boncompagni, whose birthday I don't know and whose face I've never seen, but that's his family's house, which is as close as we're going to get. He is not well known, but he represents the most stable period in the 300-year history of conversionary preaching, because he preaches every week for 39 years, from 1649 to 1688. He is a pillar of the Dominican community. He holds many leadership positions. He's a well-known philanthropist. And he is also friends with Christian Hebraist scholars, most notably Giulio Bartolocci, who is the preeminent historian in Italy in this day, not historian, Hebraicist, and author of the Bibliotheca Magna Rabbinica, which is this absolutely enormous 4-volume compendium bibliography, arguably the most important early modern Hebrew bibliography. Bartolocci contributes endorsements to the Bibliotheca Magna Rabbinica. That's that first paragraph there is his endorsement of that volume. And the Bibliotheca Magna Rabbinica, in turn, contains a long description of Boncompagni's preaching, his great skills, his friendship with other Hebraicists, which shows that he's part of this very elite scholarly network. So we can conclude that Gregorio Boncompagni, unknown as he is, nonetheless represents the Orthodox line in Catholic thinking. He is entirely part of mainstream Catholicism with lots of institutional support, and we can take him as representative. We also know that he cared profoundly about his profession as conversionary preacher to the Jews of Rome. And we know this because he left me, I would like to think, 10 volumes of conversionary sermons in manuscript, 39 years worth of weekly sermons, which are now in this collection in the Vatican. Most of his preaching revisits old techniques, the things that we have come to expect. But he also introduces important new material, and he also has notes and annotations which show his self-reflection and his reflection on his job and why his job is the way it is. That's what I'm going to spend the most time on today. In order to understand his innovations, we're going to take a moment to review what techniques for conversionary preaching are already in place, what's the tradition that he's coming from. So in terms of rhetoric, conversionary sermons in the early modern period are a particular subgenre of preaching derived from an interrelated group of medieval sources, primarily disputations, and the growing body of polemical conversionary treatises that surround them. These sources, which I know are deeply familiar to some of you, shared a rhetorical strategy. Their goal was often to prove, or in general, to prove that canonical Jewish texts, Scripture, Talmud, Kabbalah, were in fact validations of Christian doctrine regarding the Messiah if you read them correctly. So Christian priests and polemicists grappled closely with these texts, working their way through a series of exegetical proofs. They argued that if read correctly, the Hebrew Bible would reveal that the Messiah had already come, that the Messiah was in fact Jesus Christ, and that he was born of a virgin. And they sometimes also insisted that later rabbinic authors knew this and had concealed this information from the faithful. And so medieval disputations and polemics set a precedent for exegetical close reading, analysis of grammar, and detailed discussion of doctrine in biblical and rabbinic texts. And these are the techniques that pass directly into conversionary sermons. And one medieval typical example is the preaching campaign of Paolo Cristiani after the Barcelona disputation, which takes its cue directly from the disputations. The bulls of the 16th century add a set of further constraints. Sermons were supposed to emphasize the advent and incarnation of Christ, his birth, life, miracles, passion, death, burial, descent into hell, resurrection, ascension, and later confirmation of his gospel through the miracles and preachings of apostles. They should point out the desolation and dispersion of the Jews, the frustration of their vain hopes, and the duplicity of their rabbis in promoting false interpretations of Scripture. I'm paraphrasing the bulls here. They also need to do this while tying each sermon into the weekly parashah that would have been read that morning. So 16th century and 17th century conversionary preachers have a very tight set of constraints. I like to think of this as a lost opportunity. Conversionary preaching as a weekly regular event is actually a substantially new preaching ritual, but one in which it was almost impossible to display any rhetorical creativity. And yet, 100 years after this legislation has been put into place and the preaching has been set up, Boncompagni introduces new techniques and new topics. Maybe this is because people kind of get lax after 100 years, maybe it's because he's bored. I have other theories about why this is, but he introduces material that is, as far as I know, unprecedented in conversionary sermons. I'm going to run through all of them and spend more time on some than on others. So, sorry, standard disputation picture. I missed that. Right, so one threat is Turks and Ottomans, what he calls them all Turki, a threat which appears exacerbated to him after the Battle of Lepanto in 1575, the great Catholic League victory over the Ottomans, after which he wonders why it is that Muslims have not all yet converted to Christianity. He also devotes a few sermons to 4 recently canonized or beatified saints. Francis Xavier, the Apostle of the Indies, Francis de Sales, who is known for his work in Geneva with Protestants, Rose of Lima, who is the first saint to be beatified and canonized from the New World, and Pope Pius V, whom he portrays as the winner, of the miraculous winner of the Battle of Lepanto. So again, he has departed radically from tradition and legislation in order to bring in unorthodox topics, all of which represent this very new form of global triumphalist Catholicism. And he knows it's controversial, and the way that we can see that is that he builds a justification of his actions into his sermon for every single new saint he discusses. So for example, when he talks about Rose of Lima, whom he calls La Beata Rosa, he says, "For what purpose is the sermon on Beata Rosa to the Jews?" And the answer is, whoever negates the root negates the trunk, branches, and the whole tree. Jews negate Christ, and so they negate all the saints. But then he goes on immediately to describe how Beata Rosa is a personal model for him. He helps him in his argumentation by having a style that is simple and straightforward. And he says, "You don't need exquisiteness of concept, but efficacy of reasons. With her low and so humble style, Beata Rosa assists me with her powerful intercession." So he feels a direct connection. He doggedly pursues his desire to talk about saints, even when he is impeded by bad weather. There's a little note saying, here's a very long sermon, it wasn't delivered because it was raining. or even when he's impeded by the reactions of his audience. And the notable example is Pius IV, on whom he tries to deliver a conversionary sermon 4 times. And there are 4 different sermons, and one of them, the entire point of the sermon, is to justify the idea of preaching about Pius V to the Jews of Rome. One of the things that he mentions about Pius V, which I just point out as a point of interest, is that he mentions Pius's conversionary efforts towards the Jews of Rome a century earlier, including his desire to convert Jews and his success in converting Eliakorkos, one of the most prominent Jews of the 16th century, with the entire Korkos family. This is notable for 2 reasons. One is that contemporary references in conversionary sermons are extremely rare. The other is that Korkos is our preacher's either grandfather or great uncle. He is the descendant of the Korkos family. So, given the force of tradition and legal constraint around conversionary preaching, it is, to me, entirely astonishing that sermons on contemporary figures with contemporary references exist at all, even as a tiny minority of his preaching. I want to spend the rest of my time today on Boncompagni's acts of self-reflection. These show up in 3 ways. They show up in sermons themselves, in lists in his manuscripts, and in marginal notes and annotations. So I will give you, for example, 3 sermon titles. The reason why many do not convert to the faith of Christ, however much the truth of it is sufficiently explained, and whether it is good or not for Catholics to dispute with infidels. Whether one should preach to the Jews with sweetness or with bitterness. This is a very short sort of draft of a sermon. It's only about a paragraph long. And the one that is most important to me, we ask whether it is permitted to preach to the Jews, dispute with the Jews, and preach publicly to Jews in the presence of Christians, and we resolve the doubts of the Jews. I'm going to spend a little time on this sermon. It comes in a number of parts. The first thing he asks is, why a sermon and not a disputation with Jewish speakers and Christian speakers? And he says, look, I know you would like this. You would find that fair and balanced, to borrow a phrase. But I reject this idea entirely, because you cannot treat as equal truth and lies. This is the same argument exactly as today's platformers. It's how I feel about sharing a table, climate change deniers. And I think that in some ways, he is actually confirming the argument of many scholars of medieval disputations who suggest that having a disputation is a form of validating the fundamental similarities between Christianity and Judaism. He also argues, or he brings up a long-standing idea about disputations, that they are dangerous because they might lead Jews and Christians to interact and to discuss religion. And then he raises a very valid point. Well, in that case, why can't we have disputations in Rome, where Jews and Christians already interact with each other, where we have plenty of learned Christians, and where there's already discussion of religion between Christians and Jews? And his answer to this is that Jews don't know how to behave in disputations. They only yell, they propose problems, they spend the whole time thinking about what they're going to say next instead of listening to see if the other guy has a point. And they think whoever yells loudest wins, and they subvert the process with fallacies and sophism. A great deal of the rest of the sermon is devoted to the question of Christians at the sermon. And he says, what's interesting here is that many scholars have speculated on the function of conversionary sermons in the presence of Christians, concluding that it is as much for the Christians as it is for the Jews. We don't expect preachers to admit this themselves, but he does. He says, this reinforces the faith of all listeners, including new Christians and old Christians. He says that conversionary sermons contain material that is useful to Christians that they would not hear in any other sermon that was preached to them directly. He also argues that it keeps the Jewish audience better behaved than they would be if they were alone in the room. So he's doing a number of things with this argumentation. Some of it is lecturing to the Jews and telling them to back down from their push for disputation and to resist conversionary sermons a little bit less. But he's also encouraging Christians to attend by reminding them of their importance and value at the sermon and the value of the sermons to them. And more broadly, he's using the sermon as a way of justifying the continuation of a century-old practice and to justify his own position and employment as a conversionary preacher. Now, an interesting thing happens with this sermon, which is that it shows up twice in the back of that volume. That is in a list form, right? This is one of the lists. This is the second one. We ask whether at the sermons to Jews, Christians must attend the sermons, and we respond yes. And then there's a list of 12 reasons, which is clearly derived from the sermon itself. And then 2 pages later, or in this case 2 pages earlier, we get another list, condensed again into 9 reasons, called "We ask whether at the sermons to Jews that take place in Rome it is better to exclude Christians, as the Jews are currently asking." That's the one that you have here. So that's the second list. It's been cut down into 9 reasons. So he's taking the sermon and he is thinking about other formats that this argumentation might have. And in fact, a version of the list shows up in the 3rd volume of the Bibliotheca Magna Rabbinica, which is published by his good friend 10 years later. And we know that the sermon came first because the sermon is dated 15th of July, 1673, and this volume is from a decade later. The Bibliotheca Magna Rabbinica is very well known, but what we can see from this is that the discussions it contains derive directly from, had their origin in Boncompagni's conversionary sermon. And this is a book that I was talking to Paul about yesterday. Missionaries that have nothing to do with Jews request a copy of this to take with them on their missions. So this sermon has now, in many ways, traveled to all of the globe. And it reinforces the idea that Christian interest, it reinforces the concept of Christian interest, of Christians watching Jews in early modern Europe, and of the validity and necessity of a Christian presence in Jewish conversion. He also has another list, reasons to preach to the Jews, at the back of another manuscript, which we can talk about another time. But I want to concentrate also on the notes that he leaves to himself in the margins and the discussions that he has, from which we can see how he feels about his job. So, for example, in his sermon on Francis de Sales, he has a little note. "Francis de Sales was so powerful and capable in converting souls. May he wish from heaven to give me force to convert these Jews." So, like with Rose of Lima, he is comparing himself to the greatest missionary saints. And my favorite of these, and not because I live in that part of the world, is where he says in a note, "I wish that it would happen to me what happened to St. Patrick, that saint who baptized 7 crown kings, who converted Scotland, England, and Ireland, who revived 70 dead," unclear word, these are difficult transcriptions, I think refuting the obstinacy of those to whom he had preached. He traversed the world in his pastorate, he rescued a young girl from the fires of hell, converted all those countries, and made a great many of those people who heard him into saints, thanks to the fear of that fire. And then he has an even better note for me. At the end of the sermon on John the Baptist, and I spent hours and hours working out what it says. It's covered in ink spots, so forgive me that it's not as clear as it should be, where he says, "This sermon was the first one done by me, Gregorio. It is worth nothing. It was pure practice. The Jews negated it with total ease, although they knew only the basics of the gospel, which is negated by the Jews." And I didn't, I think, abrogate it or get back to them because I didn't want my ignorance to show. It was on the 24th of June, 1649. Nobody should take up preaching to the Jews who is not a good theologian, who is not conversant in the canons of the Old Testament, and not without reading Rabbot, Ezra, I think is what it says, Isaiah, and Yolkut. It is necessary to have Rabbi Bravanel on the prophets and confute him. This is something he's clearly writing much later. As you can see, today, when I have preached to the Jews already 40 years, it being 1689, I say that if I had to begin preaching again, I would not wish to do any other office than to preach to Jews, not to Christians, only to Jews, to preach in the order put by Holy Scripture with commentaries. Then he goes on to talk a little bit about how good his Hebrew has gotten and how qualified he is. Okay, so what do we learn from all of this? The surest thing that we learn is that converting the Jews mattered to him. But I want to take a moment and step back and think about what function these very difficult to find notes have for the purpose of this conference. A lot of studies of early modern conversion have focused both on the experience of the converted and on the importance of the conversion narrative, particularly in a time when suspicion of early modern converts and their motives was commonplace, both then and perhaps now. Here we have the flip side. We have the opportunity to see the inner experience of the converter himself, and it might even be a platform for constructing a converter narrative to balance out the conversion narratives that are now familiar to us. And I think that might be one of the unspoken aims of this conference. And this is, of course, especially useful in the medieval and early modern period, full of both concern for and suspicion about conversion. So if we look at what we know about conversion narratives, what scholars have determined at this point about conversion narratives, we can say, I'll recap the conclusions of scholars. First of all, the conversion narratives are constructed. They have to conform to external constraints and conventions. We can find individual motives in them, but they are filtered through standard formats and genres that we have to be a little suspicious of. Secondly, that no model of conversion or conversion narrative can be applied broadly. They always have to be seen in their very particular local context. And thirdly, that it's not really helpful to separate practical and religious motives in conversion. To quote Todd Edelman's recent book on Jewish conversion, conversions of convenience and conversions of conviction are not altogether dissimilar. And I think that we're likely to reach the same sort of conclusions about converter narratives. And we can see that through the case of Boncompagni. He absolutely, without doubt, has to conform to the constraints of the church and the institutions that formed him. His particular concerns are determined by the unique local circumstances of the Roman conversionary campaign, everything from the choice of Francis Xavier to the concern for Christian spectators. And his sermons and notes and reflections show that in an inflexible system, here, I won't distract you, there we go. In an inflexible system, he's most of all concerned with justifying the status quo. His own position as a preacher is both convenient. He clearly, I think, got the job because he has this family connection with Jews, but it is equally full of personal conviction and commitment to his mission. He's stuck in the status quo, but he's not taking it for granted. He is reviewing and reconsidering his profession. And we see that he cares deeply, as I said, about converting the Jews. This leads him to try new topics that are controversial, and he knows it. It leads him to reflect on his job and the way it is. It leads him to do those reflections in public. And what we see about his ideas of conversion are that he expects an intellectual conversion based on theological grounds through the act of rhetorical persuasion. All of the loftiest ideas about how conversion happens, he holds. But he equally expects that conversion can only take place through the personal excellence and piety of the agent. He compares himself, usually badly, to at least 3 major saints, you can see that he's completely invested in this conversionary project. And it is perhaps his own conviction that answers the unanswered question left over from my abstract. Why is it that despite all of his intellectual eminence and his professional output, why does he nonetheless consider himself a failure? Well, for him, there's only one measure of success. Strengthening the faith of Christian spectators doesn't count, even though he said explicitly it's important. Lasting fame doesn't count. He didn't publish anything. The only thing that matters to him is conversion of the Jews through the excellence of the preacher. And I'm on my last paragraph, but it's a killer, so bear with me. Here. I don't know how we did that, but hang on. This is a little note written on the frontispiece of one of his sermon collections. I like to think that it is the last thing that he wrote, where he says, and I'm going to leave you with this quote because I can't top it. This is a collection of papers entitled or dedicated to St. Vincent Ferrer, who converted 29,000 Jews. I, who up to now have preached to them, I believe, 40 years, I doubt that I have ever converted even one. Because even though many were baptized in my time, I don't think any one of them converted because of my sermons, because of my very great ignorance, my negligence, and for my enormous malice, because I preached with words and not with good and holy works. So in the end, conversion of the Jews, he feels, is entirely up to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, for introducing to us this amazing agent or companion. And now we move to our second lecture today by Agnieszka Jagodzinska from Wrocław. Agnieszka is an assistant professor at the Department of Jewish Studies at the University of Wrocław, from where she graduated. She also studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and the University College of London. Her academic interests focus on the history of and culture of the Jews in the 19th and early 20th century, including issues such as Jewish acculturation and integration, Christian-Jewish relations, conversion of Jews to Christianity, Jewish universalism, Jewish iconography, and press. She specializes in the history of British Protestant missions to the Jews. She is the author of several articles on this subject and of a monograph and an editor of source collection in Polish and English, collections in Polish and English. Her major book on the missions and literature of the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews is coming out in May. It came out, so you can see when it was sent. It came out this month. Yeah. And she'll speak today on tools in the hands of God, the missionaries of the London Society, and the role in the conversion of the Jews. Please, Agnieszka.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and I thank the organizer for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to come back to Beersheba. And today, with my paper, we skip a couple of centuries. We move forward to the 19th century. And today I would like to tell you about the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews, which was the oldest and the largest British Protestant organization that carried specifically this kind of missions. It was established in 1809 in London, but soon moved beyond English borders, reaching communities in almost 3 different continents, in Europe, Asia, and Africa. One of the most important missionary fields was the Kingdom of Poland, with its large Jewish population. Thanks to the unique collections of archival materials from England, Poland, and Israel, the Polish case, in my opinion, offers an important insight into the dynamics of Christian missions and Jewish conversion. In my paper, I wish to address the following questions. What was the understanding of the religious conversion in the evangelical missionary enterprise? How were the missionaries of the London Society expected to promote Christianity amongst the Jews, specifically in Poland in the 19th century and early 20th century? What was the role in this process? What were the means and strategies which they used? As I'm going to argue in my paper, although the conversion was perceived as purely spiritual process, depending solely on the decision of a convert, the missionaries of the society were expected to facilitate the religious, social, and cultural transition between the Jewish and Christian world. In order to understand the missions of the London Society and the way in which this organization perceived the conversion of Jews, we should start with its historical background. The establishment of this missionary society, like of many other British initiatives of this kind in this time, was a result of the 18th century Protestant awakening, known also as the Evangelical Revival. The revival influenced not only the religious conditions in Great Britain, but also its social life, giving rise to the unprecedented development of charity institutions, schooling, healthcare system, or even inspiring anti-slavery movement. The goal of this Protestant awakening was to revive spiritual life of Christians, encouraging them to rekindle their religious enthusiasm, to study Bible, and to lead a pious life full of charity acts. Spiritual renewal required a conversion understood as a God-inspired change of heart. As the historian Brian Stanley pointed out, I quote, evangelical Christians saw their conversion as intense drama, culminating in conviction of sin, and a free and conscious choice by the individual, albeit under the persuasive influence of the Holy Spirit, to yield his or her sphere of personal sovereignty to the Lordship of Christ. The end of quote. In a similar way, evangelical missionaries perceived the conversion of non-Christian, including Jews, to whom they directed their missionary efforts. The missionaries were convinced that such religious metamorphosis can be inspired by God alone, and men cannot act as agents of someone else's conversion. Thus, neither a missionary could convert another person, nor such person could be converted. He or she could only convert him or herself. In other words, the decision to convert rested solely on the shoulders of a potential believer. No one could undergo the process of conversion, again understood by the evangelicals as a God-inspired change of heart, in their stead, let alone to force them to do that. The evangelical missionaries, including the missionaries of the London Society, did have, however, a role to play in this theater of conversion. Although they could not persuade anyone into converting against their will or better judgment, they could promote the Christian message, hoping that it would eventually lead with the help of the Holy Spirit, as they believed, to the desired effect. The London Society, when it was criticized for not making many Jewish converts, repeatedly reminded about its original goal, and here I quote again, "The friends of Israel ought always to bear in mind that the object of the society is not to baptize Jews, but to promote Christianity amongst them, and that a return of baptism administered by our missionaries can afford no test whatever of the results of the labor." The end of quote. The agents of the society working in the field offered similar explanations. One of the missionaries working in the Kingdom of Poland wrote in 1853, I quote, "People can only use means to an end, but the blessing of conversion of Israel must come from God." The end of quote. On one hand, such voices can be treated as a justification for the missionary failure if it is to be measured in the number of baptized Jews, but on the other hand, they remind that the evangelicals were interested primarily in the quality and not quantity of the conversion. What mattered for the evangelical missionaries was conversion and not baptism, change of heart and not change of the religion. The reports mention cases where a missionary had to refuse to baptize a Jew as he found him or her unconverted or asking for a baptism for merely worldly reasons, as they understood it. So if the missionaries were not perceived as agents of conversion or did not perceive themselves as agents of conversion, what role exactly they were expected to play in the process? In order to answer this question, I suggest we turn to the instruction for missionaries which were printed for the internal use of the London Society. They not only defined the role of the missionary agents, but also regulated their duties, including a long list of do's and don'ts. Despite the obviously prescriptive character of the source, instructions are interesting testimony of how the London society perceived Jews and how it understood its own missions to them. The first edition of these instructions was published in 1824. It commanded the missionaries to study Jewish languages, read Jewish texts, get to know Jewish customs in order to be prepared to dispute with Jews, but also to take interest in their contemporary social and political life in various countries. If Jews would refuse to debate on the religious subjects, such knowledge of secular aspects of Jewish life was expected to become handy, I quote. Of these things they will always be glad to hear, even if they dislike your spiritual instruction, the end of quote. The London Society declared that its missions to the Jews were motivated by the sense of the deep concern for their well-being and by the Christian debt and duty towards God's chosen nation, whose members had been severely mistreated in the past. The instruction reminded the missionaries, I quote again, "Let all your deportment convince them," meaning Jews, "that you have their welfare deeply at heart, that no sinister motive sways you, but that you are seeking their salvation from a deep sense of the value of their souls," the end of quote. The agents of the society were also instructed to show genuine sympathy to the Jewish suffering, I quote again, "Not only seem the friend, but also be so." And to prove that, I quote again, you do not engage in arguments merely to make proselytes, but that you consider the felicity of the Gentiles connected with the glory of the Jews," the end of quote. In the evangelical understanding, the fate of the church and the second coming of Christ was connected to the conversion of the Jews. However, Jews were treated merely as an object of missions and very often portrayed in a patronizing way, to say the least. The society refused to see in them a real people. They were rather an imagined and symbolic entity whose concept and image were crafted according to the Christian needs. As Barbara Tuchman put it, I quote, "The Jews were simply the instrument through which the biblical prophecy could be fulfilled. They were not a people, but a mass error that must be brought to a belief in Christ in order that the whole chain reaction leading to the second coming and the redemption of the mankind might be set in motion," the end of quote. Moreover, for the society, Judaism was never a legitimate religion with its rightful traditions, texts, and customs, but rather an aberration that needed to be corrected. The instruction of the London Society from 1824 compared a Jew to a sick patient and a missionary to a doctor who was supposed to treat their condition. I quote, "Consider all their suspicion, prejudice, misstatement, angry disputations as a symptom of a disease which is your object to cure," the end of quote. These patronizing and judgmental statements were removed from the subsequent editions of the instruction of the society, when the society decided to focus more on regulating practical issues of the missionary labor in the field. And what strategies did the missionaries working in the field use in order to promote Christianity among the Jews? In answer to this question, I would like to refer to my research on the case of the missions to the Jews in the Kingdom of Poland, which were carried out in this territory between 1821 and 1855, and later from 1855 till 1939. Although some of the methods and strategies that missionaries used in Poland were adapted to the specific character of the Polish Jewry, the majority of them was also employed in the missions of the London Society conducted in other countries. The missions in the Kingdom of Poland were carried out in two modes, one stationary and the other traveling. The missionary stations were located in several cities and towns, and their number changed over the time. The agents of the society were engaged there in preaching, instructing candidates for baptism, distributing of the missionary literature and church services. Additionally, the main station in Warsaw supervised an institution called the House of Industry, which offered work to so-called inquirers and converts who were employed there and at printing and binding books. The case of the House of Industry is just one of many examples showing that the role of the missionaries in the life of convert did not begin nor end with their baptism. The missionary who guided him or her through the process of conversion, providing them with Christian literature, instructing in the dogmas of Christianity, was also expected to offer counseling and assistance, very often not only spiritual, after baptism. A convert needed to adapt to the new community not only in religious terms, but also socially and culturally. The missionaries facilitated this transition, teaching converts, for example, non-Jewish language required in contact with the Christian community, assisting with finding job opportunities, making social connections between a convert and other Christians. Apart from operating in the mission stations, the missionaries were also traveling through the Kingdom of Poland in order to spread the message. The journeys were undertaken a few times a year from early spring till late autumn, and the society expected its agents to visit towns and villages inhabited by the Jewish population and engage there in preaching, religious disputes, and the circulation of missionary literature. Upon their arrival to a new place, they would stop Jews in the street, trying to begin a conversation with them. Not always it would start with a religious topic, though. Thank you. Sometimes missionaries would buy a small item from a Jewish shopkeeper or use services offered by Jews in order to gain their trust and establish some kind of positive relation. 2 days ago we heard about merchants being successful as missionaries, and now we see how missionaries are trying to be successful posing as merchants. They would also ask about one's daily routine, family or business, and after that they would try to make a connection between a personal situation of their interlocutor and the teachings of the Christianity. The London Society believed that the most effective way of approaching Jews would be to send together a Gentile and a Christian, Gentile missionary and a Jewish convert who would assist him in his work. I use specifically this pronoun him, as in the 19th century we did not have any female missionaries to the Jews in the Kingdom of Poland. Female missionaries entered the scene only in the beginning of the 20th century. This pair of missionaries would together use make use of knowledge of Jewish languages, customs, and religious practices. In the initial phase of the contacts of the missionaries with the Jews in the Kingdom of Poland, Jews believed the missionaries to be their foreign brethren or members of some Jewish sects. It was evident that very often Jews did not recognize missionaries as being Christian during the first encounters. This was of course caused by the presence of a missionary who was a converted Jew himself, but also because of non-Jewish missionaries of the London Society who were trained in Hebrew and also in Yiddish, which is another important element. The most vital element of the missionary enterprise of the London Society was without any doubt its literature. The missionary writing encompassed periodicals, reports, pamphlets, tracts, biographies, autobiographies, and much more. These texts were distributed among various reading publics. Some were addressed to Christian supporters of the missions and other to Jews. Missionary tracts written for Jews represent various literary genres: sermons, addresses, religious polemics, dialogues, or short stories. Many of these texts are a religious and cultural paradox, and a close reading reveals their hybrid nature of having what we might describe as the voice of Jacob and the hands of Esau. The popular strategy in this kind of literature was to disguise the evident Christian teaching under the cover of a Jewish form. This was achieved by the use of Jewish languages, Jewish cultural code, or Jewish protagonists. The most famous 19th century missionary tract was The Old Paths by Alexander McCall, which combined the desire to evangelize with severe anti-Talmudic polemics. The Society published also numerous conversion narratives, which were of course definitely more popular among Christians than Jews. Another important strategy was to distribute Bibles in Jewish languages, which for a number of reasons were more popular than missionary tracts. A missionary historian called them even a silent messenger or a silent missionary, attesting to the expectation of the society connected to their missionary potential. To conclude, according to the evangelical understanding of conversion, the missionaries could not convert a Jew, as no man was capable of converting another. Evangelical conversions could be inspired by God alone. The missionaries, however, perceived themselves as tools in His hand. They could, and they definitely did, influence potential converts by providing them with Christian literature, offering religious instruction, and generally facilitating transition from the Jewish to the Christian world. And in this sense, we may perceive them as the agents of conversion, understood not as they did only in spiritual terms, but also taking into consideration social, cultural, and even political context of one's change of heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka, for this fascinating talk. And we have a new kind of agent, missionary in disguise. So I think.
The next chapter?
Oh, yes, we should have a list.
Oh, we have God.
Sorry?
The agent is God.
Yeah.
The agent.
The agent. Okay, our third talk is by Paul Shore. Paul has held teaching and research posts at St. Louis University, Harvard Divinity School, Oxford University, University of Wrocław, the University of Edinburgh, and Trinity College Dublin. And in 2013 was the Alan Richardson Fellow in Theology and Religion at Durham University. He is currently an adjunct professor of religious studies at the University of Regina and adjunct professor of history at Brandon University, Brandon, Manitoba, Canada. He will talk about conversion, confrontation, controversy, Jesuit responses to Islam in the 17th century.
Thank you, Ora, and as others have said, but I should repeat, thanks to the organizers of this conference, and a special thanks to Badel for answering all of my questions in the past weeks. We're back to the 17th century, and the 17th century world of the Society of Jesus, as a lot of us know, is a world of mobility, activity, and engagement with the senses, combined with a simultaneous focus on the written and spoken word. These characteristics extended to the Society's approach to conversion. Non-Catholic European students studying in Jesuit schools were confronted with potent, emblematic imagery, often accompanied with Latin tags, lavish school dramas, and processions, while the indigenous peoples living in the Jesuit reducciones of Paraguay, which we've heard about, were taught religious songs and encouraged to create plastic art representing the life of Christ and also the dangers of his adversary, the devil. Visualization and the probing of the sensory aspects of the gospel story were central to the experience of the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, undertaken yearly by each Jesuit, and these processes were intended to reinforce the immediacy and the concrete aspects of the Jesuit mission to convert the entire world. Islam, however, presented a unique challenge for these missionary fathers. Islam's restriction or complete banning of representational art precluded the deployment of emblemata, or paintings, to teach moral truths and to convey the goals of the society. Stage productions, likewise, were not acceptable in the overwhelming majority of Muslim polities, nor processions, public preaching of Christianity, and itinerant missions, all mainstays of the Baroque Jesuits, were easily accomplished in Muslim lands. The engagement of the formidable linguistic skills of Jesuit translators to propagate the truths of the faith, often with the support of the visual arts, were also restricted. Islamic societies, and in particular the Ottoman Empire, had a holy book, but as we heard yesterday at the Art Museum, they were not book cultures in the Baroque European sense, cultures that would have been producing hundreds of titles annually. So the Jesuits could not use their book culture to oppose another book culture, a typical strategy that they did in Europe. Books could not compete with books, nor could Jesuits employ the strategy of eradicating traditional indigenous patterns of settlement and social organization, for example, polygamy, which they had used in their missions in some of the colonial empires. Appeals to educated elites, which stressed the similarity between Christian ethics and local ethical systems, such as those that Matteo Ricci had used among the mandarins of the Chinese Empire, gained little traction in the Ottoman world. Grave penalties associated with leaving Islam blocked another way forward. In other words, it was very difficult to assemble Jesuit priests and brothers from a converted Muslim population. Yet despite all these handicaps, the 17th century society, at the peak of its influence and power, still aspired to, as it put it, the conversion of the Moors. Mastery of Turkish, Persian, and Arabic were difficult yet attainable goals. The Mediterranean littoral, with its slave and other trades, its warfare, and especially its ransom arrangements, afforded many opportunities to proselytize among Muslims. Diplomatic missions to Muslim states provided another way forward, as did the sizable Maronite population which existed in Italy, whose native command of Arabic and its familiarity, to an extent, with Islamic practices was a great aid to Jesuit translators and future missionaries. With these facts as a context, let's briefly consider the accomplishments of two Jesuits, Michelson and Ignazio Lomellini, whose engagement with Islam and with the Arabic language shed light on the society's objectives and approaches to the Quran and to those who follow its teachings. Michelson was born in 1633 in Tours and traveled to the Holy Land in the suite of the French ambassador to the Sublime Porte. Those further travels are not clear, but it is evident that he was in Aleppo, and according to some accounts, he also visited Constantinople and Persia. No learned Arabic well and produced a volume, Religio Christiana, that features passages from the Quran presented in Arabic typeface. This book was published in Paris. He's also credited with an Arabic translation of this same text, a copy of which survives in Beirut, but which has not yet been edited or published. No's knowledge of Arabic, acquired from years of living among native speakers, is important and is indeed surprising when considering the inaccuracies of his Quranic translations. Time will not really permit me to go into a lot of detail about these. I'll mention one very briefly, the famous phrase, al Kitab, often translated as the people of the book, and which may refer to Christians, Jews, and Sabians, is translated by No as possessores al Qurani. A curious translation. There are several possible explanations for this lexical choice. No may have wanted to set a clear distance between Catholic Christians, such as himself, and other monotheists in the region. By objectifying the possessores al-Qurani as a population to be proselytized, No identified their defining characteristic, as well as their fundamental error in his view, but also, viewed from a less confrontational perspective, No's translation is a starting point for understanding what it is these possessores know and believe. By focusing on a book, Jesuits so often return ultimately to focusing on a book, No draws on his own familiarity with the book culture of the Jesuits and their way of proceeding with written texts. A book can be consulted, its precise words analyzed and of course refuted, and this is a game or ludus with rules that can be followed and with winners and losers identified. Finally, No's lexical choices can reflect his awareness of how Muslims regarded any criticism of their holy text as its possessores. Muslims, No seems to have understood, will defend the Quran, and any attempt to engage them in religious debate needs to take that fact into account. Of course, all these factors may have played a role in his lexical choice. Elsewhere, No's lexical errors seem to work inevitably to the advantage of the Christian missionary, or at least to the advantage of the Christian missionary writing for a Christian audience. Remember that this book ultimately is published in Paris. He translates al-Masih, a designation deriving from the Hebrew concept of the Messiah, but which in Arabic, of course, is distinct from the Christian idea of Christ. He translates it simply and consistently as Christus. Now, this term is a plausible, literal rendering of the Arabic, up to a point being a Latin form of the Greek word for anointed, which is also the literal meaning of the Arabic. Yet after work for years as a missionary, No certainly would have understood that Muslims would not accept this equivalency. So perhaps the translation was intended much more for the Christian audiences of Europe than for the Muslims among whom he'd originally worked. Now, No's book exhibits many errors in the transcription of the Quran, which they may reflect on the materials that he had access to as a missionary, and certainly these mistakes would have hindered his attempts to convert Muslims. On just one page of the Religio Christiana appear 6 errors in the reproduced Arabic text of the Quran. The possible reasons for these errors range from inferior sources to difficulties with typesetting. The former may reflect the mediation of Maronite informants whose familiarity with the Quran may have been less than perfect. The latter possibility could have resulted from the employment by typesetters of a different copy of the Quran than No had used. This is a problem that another Quran translator, Ludovico Maracci, in 1698 complains about privately, and saying, I've been working on the Quran for years, but the text that appears next to my Latin translation is not the text that I used. These errors may suggest a gap also, and I think this is key, between the spoken Arabic that No used in his daily interactions when in Aleppo, as opposed to his command of the written language, which may have been much weaker. Now, the career of Ignazio Lomellini is almost the opposite of that of No. Also a Jesuit, Lomellini was born to one of the most important noble families of Genoa, and he joined the society at the ripe old age of 28 in 1587, almost maybe a dozen years older than most Jesuit trainees for the priesthood. We don't know what he was doing previous to that, and we know practically nothing about what he did after he entered the society, although he lived another 58 years. He published nothing. He made no known journeys as a missionary, and despite his decades-long residence in Rome, he doesn't seem to have had much contact with the leadership of the Jesuits. Lomellini's one known achievement, however, is of signal importance. In the years before 1622, he completed the first translation of the Quran into a Western European language that included the entire Arabic text of the original. This translation, which has sat in a library in Genoa for at least 175 years, has received little attention from scholars, but it is also, in my opinion, the best translation into Latin that had been undertaken up to that time. Now, the relation of Lomellini's work, which is supplemented and at times almost overwhelmed by his learned commentaries, which are clearly aimed at Christian audiences, what that relationship is to Islam is not as readily apparent as it is in the case of Michel No's work. Lomellini did not prepare this translation, which exists only in one copy and which is not a fair copy. In fact, it contains many crossed out words. He did not prepare this for his own future work as a missionary. He lived and died in Rome. He may have developed the translation for classroom use, in which young Jesuits were trained for missionary work among Muslims, but the surviving records of Lomellini's service to the Jesuits give no hint that he taught such classes. The translation is dedicated to Cardinal Alessandro Orsini, who, although we don't know whether this cardinal, who was a patron of Galileo, ever even received the manuscript, the dedication does suggest the context and the direction of Lomellini's task. In other words, he's writing to a very highly placed church official who also served as the godfather to many Muslim children who were baptized in Italy, and who also collected Arabic texts. So we get at least a glimpse of what Lomellini's intentions were. I've been so far unable to identify with absolute certainty a number of rather enigmatic marginal references to Arabic texts. Lomellini will write to himself in the margin, be sure to check the book, the very old book that is bound in red leather that His Excellency the Cardinal owns, and so forth. Now, the elaborate apologetics presented in the commentaries were intended for educated Catholics who can appreciate the references to the Bible and to Catholic and patristic authors, but they also point to the ways in which the translation might work for the processes of proselytizing and conversion. The arguments, especially of the characteristics of Christ and of his lex or law, as understood by devout Catholics of the day, are constantly put in opposition to the Quran as the alleged lex of the Muslims. Now, by defining the Quran in his own terms, and then pointing out its alleged failures within that category, Lomellini articulated the space within which Jesuits might present their arguments to literally captive audiences, by which I mean prisoners of war and slaves in places like Malta, which were constantly subjected to proselytizing efforts by Jesuits. Another group that might respond favorably to the contrasting of the person of Jesus as understood by Lomellini with that of Isa in the Quran were former Christians who had converted to Islam. This group will overlap with the two groups just mentioned, slaves and captives, and it will also include women as well. Lomellini's commentaries devote a lot of space to the personality of Muhammad. Not surprisingly, the prophet is described in highly negative terms, which not only echo stereotypes regarding Muslim men then current, but which can readily be deployed in a debate contrasting Jesus and Muhammad. For example, in a commentary on Surah 33, Ayah 53, Lomellini seems to be indicating the alleged alcoholic intemperance of Muhammad. This ayah discusses the deportment of guests at the Prophet's house. Overindulgence of food and alcohol are not mentioned explicitly, but we do read that the guests' conduct troubled Muhammad. In Lomellini's Latin, nacuit profeta. The prohibition against marrying Muhammad's wives and the requirement that guests speak to these wives through an intervening screen after the Prophet's death may suggest a sexual subtext to the ayah, and sexual subtexts are things that Lomellini never passed on. He grabbed them wherever he thought he could find them. Elsewhere, Lomellini finds fault with Muhammad's presumed social status and level of education, and repeatedly refers to Muhammad's mendacity. These commentaries, which appear to derive almost entirely from non-Hadithic sources, provide ammunition for the sort of ad hominem Jesuit attacks on the prophet that very much parallel simultaneous attacks that were being made by other Jesuits on the personality and character of Martin Luther. As the 17th century continued, conversion narratives reported in the Society's records could count only a tiny handful of Muslims brought to the true faith. So this certainly parallels what we just heard about efforts to convert Jews in Rome in the 17th century. Compared to the Society's other successes, and even with its dramatic failures in, for example, Japan and Ethiopia, the entire story here has a rather more low-key quality. The few records that we have of conversions are notable, in my view, both for the prominence given to women and also the way in which women are often described in not merely spiritual terms. Here is one Muslim woman who was described by Jesuits who converted in the 1640s in Naples. Kata, a 25-year-old young woman, was tall, noble, and lovely. Extremely talented, as noble people often are. She claimed to be the daughter of a Muslim ruler. Kata's post-mortem beauty can be compared to Kateri Katathawiya, the 17th century Mohawk Canadian saint whose cult was also promoted at the same point by Jesuits. Again, a presumably Muslim woman rescued from the fortress of Eger in Ottoman-dominated Hungary is described in a similar way, having noble character and a noble figura. Here and there's a male Muslim prisoner, often facing execution, who's reported converted. What is striking about these conversion accounts is the emphasis that is placed on a conversion that was not the result of the sort of hierarchical formal schooling that the Jesuits provided, and not closely related even to the experience of the spiritual exercise. I have so far not found any trace in conversion accounts in Jesuit sources that present the sort of arguments that Lomellini and No assemble in their writings. This suggests the degree to which the Jesuit one-size-supposedly-fits-all with its agonistic features to interreligious debates failed to address the realities of prisoners and battlefields, and likely seems to have missed the mark when it was applied to Muslim women. We know about specific Jesuit efforts to convert Muslims from annual letters, the Literae Annue, which are often mined by historians. It's also worth remembering that these documents, several years of which were published, had an extensive lay and even non-Catholic readership. Reports produced by individual Jesuit communities or unpublished and therefore unedited reports would have been read only by other Jesuits. And the effect of having these varying, often overlapping audiences on reportage meant that Christian audiences, which could include potential allies or adversaries of the Jesuits as well as donors, were never completely out of the Jesuit writer's mind when he was discussing a conversion event. In conclusion, the Jesuit missionary response to the unique challenges presented by Islam, and in particular those presented by the Quran, was shaped by three factors. The first, and perhaps most important of these, was the Society's organization around formalized hierarchical schooling and the experience of those trained in such schools in the polemical environment of the Christian interconfessional conflict in Europe. This background led Jesuits to employ logical argument, grammatical analysis, lexical equivalencies, and rhetorical events to prove, as I've mentioned, that the Quranic lex did not measure up to the lex Christi. This tendency was reinforced when other avenues, such as the production of edifying drama, were closed. that formal debates between Jesuits and Muslim clerics were extremely rare, and I'm only aware of one in the entire Jesuit province of Austria, which occurred in Ottoman Hungary in the middle of the 16th century. Formal debates were very, very rare, yet it did not, this fact did not deter Jesuits from assembling arguments and apologetics that were equally applicable with the changing of a few nouns and pronouns to rebut Protestant positions. This approach that I've just described, approach number one, had very disappointing results when applied to Muslims. Secondly, actual proselytizing among Muslims was typically directed among the most vulnerable, captives, women, children, and the sick and dying. This tactic permitted Jesuits to fulfill their understanding of their commission to minister to the outcast and the needy, while allowing them to concentrate their efforts on populations that were most likely to produce the desirable high body count that could be turned in a report. Work among these vulnerable populations also provided the raw material for dramatic accounts of Jesuit engagement with demonic forces, grappling for the soul of the possible convertee in settings such as prisons. These stories found their way into publications that served as the Jesuits' recruiting tools. It is worth remembering how different these settings were from the ideally suited debates which Lomellini and No were developing. The difference here is correlated with, if not causally linked to, the Jesuit categories of coadjutor spiritualis, which is a priest, but he is trained as a spiritual helper. He's a foot soldier typically, in contrast to Jesuits who had taken the fourth vow and who were typically the elite. The former were more often involved in pastoral work that might find them in settings where eventually they might meet Muslims. But Lomellini, the Quranic scholar spending 30 years on a text, may never have met a Muslim. Thirdly, the reputation of the society as a strictly regimented organization, notwithstanding, many Jesuits maintained considerable leeway in both their translating and missionary activities. The stream of action was the inevitable result, in part, to the realities of communication and travel in the 17th century, but it was also an artifact of the society's culture and of its recruiting practices, which attracted and promoted many strong-minded and independent personalities. Lomellini's translation of a text that was already on the Index Prohibitorum and the subsequent obscurity of that translation following the death of his patron Orsini in 1626 point to the crucial role of patrons and protectors of Jesuits who were, as you might say, pushing the envelope and going almost too far. No also got into various scrapes, including time in a Pasha's prison during the years he spent in the Levant, but his connections to high-ranking French officials enabled him to survive his adventures and return to France, where he died in bed in 1683. Although Baroque Jesuit approaches to the Quran yielded little in the way of conversion, these tactics reveal much about how Jesuits worked as agents of conversion of those whose religion appeared to contain some points of similarity with Catholicism. In a way characteristic of the society, Jesuits operated as both primary and secondary agents, working within a worldwide organization that promoted specialized labors while constantly striving for the goal of the conversion of the world. One of the early Jesuit mottos in Latin translates as "one world is not enough." At the most abstract and centralized level, Jesuits such as Athanasius Kircher collected vast stores of linguistic and anthropological data, which through the Society's publishing enterprises were distributed to audiences that included, among them, future Jesuit missionaries. At the other end of the spectrum, the almost anonymous and lower-ranking Jesuit who achieved the conversion of a dying Muslim captive drew on an entire institutional culture and a training obtained through the curriculum of the Ratio Studiorum as he assembled his pleas on site. These individual efforts were generally well coordinated sustained for decades, and supported by what has been called the world's first multinational corporation. That the efforts of the Jesuits fell so far short of their desired goal is a conundrum which will merit the further attention of historians, missiologists, and experts in the study of translation and textual analysis for many, many years, and perhaps many, many conferences yet to come. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank the three speakers of these fascinating sessions. And our respondent is Professor Nurit Stadler of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the Hebrew University. Her research interests include Israel ultra-Orthodox community, fundamentalism, Greek Orthodox and Catholic rituals in Jerusalem. She is the author of Yeshiva Fundamentalism, Piety, Gender, and Resistance in the Ultra-Orthodox World, published with NYU Press, and of the book A Well-Worn Talis for a New Ceremony, published in 2012 with Academic Studies Press, Brighton, Massachusetts. Recently, she published her ethnographic study between scripture and performance on the worship of Mary in Jerusalem, published in Religion. Since 2012, she is involved with a project on sacred shrines in Israel-Palestine. In this project, she works on various aspects on the sacred shrines, especially female shrines, such as the tomb of Rachel the matriarch, and on the way to Bethlehem, which you know, and the tomb of Rachel, the wife of Rabbi Akiva in Tiberias. Her comparative study of these shrines opens a set of questions about the centrality of fertility cults at the age of modernity and technology of reproduction. Please move it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for these three inspiring papers. Thank you very much. The challenge to summarize and comment on three papers is always first a mission, since as we all know, they are not always connected. However, I was lucky to read and to listen to three excellent papers that are so well connected in their use of the termination of the term conversion. The three cases were discussed here. 17th century Jesuits' approach to conversion of Muslim devotees, the London Society of Promoting Christianity Among Jews, which targeted towards Polish Jewish during the 19th century, and the campaign to convert Jews in early modern Rome by Catholic institutions, a practice that began in 16th century till 18th century. These three lectures focused on strategies of conversion and the failure of these strategies. Looking at these papers from a comparative point of view, I suggest the following questions. What do we learn from failed conversion strategies? So, for example, if we take Emily's discussion, we learn about the ability to reflect, to understand about the converter's work and how he works and the way he perceives himself. Or what Paul said right now, just now, about what I think I can call self-learning of the converter. Lemidat Smith, how would you say that? Like how a converter can learn about himself while he is trying to convert others. So the second question is, what can we learn about the institutions of conversion and their approach to conversion activities? The third question will be, what do these strategies tell us about the human image in religions imaginations and conceptions about the other religion? In the case of, for example, of the Jesuits, the main strategy that was crafted and used for, like in the first example in Latin America, was what I see as the concretization of the sacred, by giving an artistic representation to the scriptures, and that's making it very, very accessible to all believers. In contrast, what we see in this paper is that Islam strongly opposes these strategies, posing a challenge to Jesuits when facing Muslim devotees. In response, the Jesuits decide to learn about the religion of the other. That is the first, it's like I'm an anthropologist, so this is what I do. And the first thing I try to learn about the other. And comprehend the essence of the human that is accepted in this religious worldview. They appreciate that the Muslim subjects were scriptural and similar to them in many aspects of their lived religion. Accordingly, they decided to translate, for example, the scriptures, central terms, to learn the language of the scriptures, to translate the Quran into Western European languages, etc. By doing so, they used a technique of textual-based juxtaposition. This way, by understanding the religion of the other, converters thought they can prove that, for example, the Quran, the text of the Quran, are inferior to Christian writings. Moreover, through an in-depth discussion and understanding of Muhammad's character, converters could criticize his personality while discussing canonical texts and rituals with what they imagined as their possible subjects. In the case of the London Society, we learn about the strategies of conversion used by a Protestant missionary organization when trying to convert Jews. Very different from the Jesuit strategy, here the basic idea of conversion is self-based God, which inspired a change of heart. In this view, it is a pure choice of the individual to decide himself, to dedicate himself to the Christian spirit. Thus, a person can only convert himself or herself. The agents of conversion can only promote the message of his or her subject. Yet, he cannot pursue people to convert or to be baptized. Very similar to Jesuits trying to convert Muslims, the society failed to convert the Jews. Again, via the analysis of failure, we learn how converters understood what conversion really is. We learn about how they perceive the other, and more specifically, how Judaism is observed by Protestants, or in the case of Catholicism, how Jews are portrayed by Romans, or how Jesuits perceive the Muslims. It should be noted that the London Society and the Jewish and the Jesuits saw scripturalism as a central feature in the other religion that should be embedded in their conversion techniques. The London Society converters decided to learn Biblical Hebrew, to read Jewish texts and refer to biblical texts as their strategy to gain familiarity and also to gain trust. When becoming familiar with the language and text, they also learn about Jewish life and politics. The agents of the London Society saw Jews as living in a privileged condition and assumed that they can offer them better life with less suffering, as they saw themselves as Christians. In many circumstances, they use Jewish converts, which they assume will know how to approach potential converts, using their native language and having a knowledge on practices and interpretation. So as an anthropologist, we also use key figures and we learn the language. So I learn a lot from these texts, how to approach other people. From the study of Catholic institutions in Rome, we learn about the old and new techniques of conversions, all which have not succeeded. From this study, again, we learn about the attitudes of the converters towards their subjects. Looking into the old techniques that were mostly based on the medieval rhetoric, we learned that Jewish scriptures were used to reinforce Christian truth, just like a prototype to Christ, or the Virgin giving birth to Jesus, etc. The reinforcement of the idea of Christ's return and the critique on the Jews' yearn for the coming of the Messiah. All these techniques failed. The reflection of converters on these ideas show a need to change them while taking into account the image of the modern Jew, or what they see as a modern Jew, especially the knowledge and dependence on the scriptures for religious and everyday practices. However, as we learned from the study at hand, the old constraints were powerful and limited all opportunities to change the Catholic notion on the Jews and the conversion techniques. Although I understand that these papers are limited to the analysis of specific institutions, as a reader, I stay curious to know about two more questions. What do we learn about the agents under conversion? Do we know anything about them? And what can we learn about the boundaries and the taboos of the agents under conversion? These are the two questions that I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nurit. Do you want to react to these two last questions?
I'll take a shot at it. I can say very, very little about Lomellini, since all I've got to work with are his commentaries. Don't have the luxury that of looking at his personal reflections. In the case of Michel, no, he published several books in French for a broad audience about the Holy Land, and he speaks with affection, I would even say, about many of the people that he met and the landscapes. But that affection is interwoven with the realization that he is, or he believes he is, in the Garden of Gethsemane, so, or other special places. So it's very, I can't see a way to separate his experience as a converter from his experience as a Christian in the Holy Land. I think they are constantly interwoven. And the only comment I can make about Lomellini, assuming that he started at the beginning of the Quran and translated to the end, the overwhelmingly negative commentaries grow shorter towards the end, but then the surahs grow shorter, and that might be just fatigue, or it might be that he's already made all these points and doesn't need to make them again. But there are times I look at it and I think this is also because he's a bit less hostile to the document that he's looking at. But that's a very subjective comment, and I'm not sure where to end up in the footnotes. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you. So the floor is open now, and Dov is the first.
Yeah, I have first a question to Paul, and then a comment to Emily. Paul, I remember the catechism written by Giambattista Eliano during the 16th century and addressed to Muslims. And what I am not an specialist, but what appears is that it was a catechism with several pictures and representations. Then my question is whether those cases you analyzed were a response to Eliano's failure to use iconography to spread Christianity, or what something else like initial questions in India were how to accommodate between Christianity and other religions. And my comment to Emily is that you didn't read the final two words of the slide. I think that it could be there a clue to understand all the miserere nobis, miserere me. Yeah, and I think that here we have to perhaps to stress or to be more sensitive first to the theatrical character of those missioners, and we are in what Lefebvre in times defined by Lefebvre, le temps des larmes, the times of of crime, and there is here perhaps also a kind of theatrical exercise which doesn't necessarily needs conversion, but the Sisyphean effort to try to obtain some of them. The second thing is that what it is very interesting from your talk is that we are a little bit switching from the medieval idea of the Judaic blindness, caequitas judaica, to the early modern Roman complaint against cacophonia judaica, yelling of the Jews, and it has of course to do with the pauperization of most of the Jewish society living in ghettos, in crowded ghettos. But it also could explain that finally, even if these persons, they longed for Vicente Ferrer, they were aware that finally, like St. Paul mentioned, or in the epistle, perhaps the Jews will not join Christianity in masses, but it is a kind of illo tempore adventment. In other words, where we are not messianic, then you are not so frustrated really that not so many Jews are not joining into the faith.
Yeah, thank you for that.
No, just very quickly, while there's a tremendous amount of continuity between the late 16th century Society of Jesus and the 17th century society, my take on Eliano is that he's working before either the Ratio Studiorum text is finalized or the spiritual exercises text is finalized. And so, and the applications of those texts to the notion of accommodation, to use a modern word, it's not yet entirely clear. And for example, did Eliano have a chance to read the letters of Xavier? If I had to guess, I'd say no, although I'm not sure. So this may be a time frame thing rather than a deliberate policy thing. That's the best ad hoc I can give you on that.
Thank you.
Do you want the microphone?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that. You've made 3 points. I agree with you on all of them, but I'll give you some detail. He absolutely is conforming to rhetorical tropes about his own inadequacies. And in fact, I left out a number of quotations because they seem to me to be entirely standard, oh, humble me, sorts of things. And some of the manuscripts are prepared for publication, although not published. And you can see that even more in these dedications to say, I didn't want to publish, I'm so bad at this, no one wanted to read it, but my friend, and all of these sort of standard forms. The ones that I chose are the ones that seem to me to depart from that a little bit and go outside the norm. Although there's only a certain point up to which we can know for sure what he was thinking. As for the transition from blindness to the cacophonia judaica, yes, this is a moment of transition, a long moment of transition in the position of Jews in Rome. And I think that what we're seeing in these sermons is a reflection of that, in that a great many of these sermons are repeating very old arguments about blindness and about stubbornness and about it's been 1,500 years and you still haven't listened to your prophets. But we also see the introduction of new material which reflects this change. So they are both present. It's simply that I'm choosing the ones in this talk that highlight the latter because they're more interesting to me. And I think that they show a moment of transition and present something new in the sermons. As for the knowledge that not all Jews will convert, which is, I think, your third point.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that that's actually a fundamental premise of conversionary preaching. I think I think conversionary preaching exists in order to demonstrate that you're at least trying, and that you're trying to do it through persuasion and not force. And if there is force, it can happen behind the scenes, and you can ignore it because, or hide it because everyone knows it happens through persuasion because, look, we have these sermons. But that fundamentally, one of the things that makes sermons powerful is that you need Jews to both convert and not convert theologically, right?
Exactly.
You need them to validate Catholicism by converting. You need them to remain as witnesses and as useful enemies by not converting. And you can have both of those things at once at a conversionary sermon in a way that you cannot in other aspects of the conversionary campaign. So that is why they continue, that is why they are public, and that is why they're useful even if they're going to be unsuccessful. So yes, you're right.
Yes, thank you all of you for your presentations. I have also a question, a few remarks for Emily. Yeah, I was very much intrigued by your presentation. And I think it's a very good way to look at sermons to get an idea about, well, the missionary or the actual agent. And I would like to know more details about what do we know about his formation, about his training. In my own work, I came across this Franciscan school of Monte Aureo, where many missionaries were trained in Arabic mainly, but also in Hebrew. So I was wondering if how did this Dominican actually got his training, and does it also reflect to some extent his training as a Dominican, as a preacher as such, and to what extent does his conversion, like conversionary sermons are different from regular sermons to Christian people?
Yeah. The position of conversionary preacher is a fixed position in Rome. When conversionary preaching starts, it kind of fluctuates who gets that job. So Jesuits do it for a bit, Franciscans do it for a bit, and then it settles into a permanent Dominican position. And it has been a Dominican position for most of the 17th century by the time he gets to it. He is schooled at Santa Maria sopra Minerva, the Dominican convent, and he's based at Santa Maria Maggiore in the penitential Liberian college where he is a confessor. Those are the two institutions that he's most involved in. So I think it is a fairly standard Dominican training, which is not, as far as I know, specifically Dominican or specific to him, but that this job gets handed from Dominican to Dominican, and what I expect is that he was chosen for it very early because of his background, so that he was probably trained up in Hebrew from a young age. I don't yet have any confirmation of that, but that's what it seems to be for me. So there's a standard sort of set of techniques and sermons and polemics that would pass from conversionary preacher to conversionary preacher within the Dominicans, and that he had access to that quite young, plus an extremely good Dominican education.
And how is that different?
How does it differ from regular sermons? Like sermons addressed, well,
Sermons addressed
primarily
to
addressed to Jews.
Right.
How do they? What extent are they different from regular sermons?
There are specific topics that are mostly, I mean, what I've shown is the introduction of new topics, but the standard old topics are, you know, Trinity, Messiah, Mary, in sort of constant rotation, whereas Christian topics are based on the liturgical calendar and have sort of, there's a broader range of subjects that are tied to the point in the year. So this is, you know, this is the week in Advent when we discuss this. This is the week for the Good Samaritan sermon. His sermons in particular are closely tied to the Parsha. The weekly Parsha is written in Hebrew on the top of many of the sermons, and often you'll find three sermons on Bereshit followed by 3 sermons on Noach, and that's not something obviously that you would ever find. And they don't follow sort of the rhetorical strategies of Catholic sermons in terms of their proemio, their division into parts. They're not drawing from the grand rhetorical strategies of conventional preachers. So they're very different, and that's, I think, why he argues that there are things in these sermons that other preachers don't, that Christians don't hear anywhere else.
So we must make it short because we have a long list of people who want to ask questions. So Effie first and then Al.
Okay. First, thank you all very much for stimulating the session. My mind is buzzing with questions, but I'm going to try and cut it short. A question for Emily regarding what you just said. I mean, it seems that, and from the biographical comment you made, the fact that he comes from a convert family, and that is why he's pitching Pius as the saint that he...
Speculation.
Okay, speculate, but okay. So I was wondering about the speculation, but was he considered for the job because of this background? Do you know?
That's the bit I don't know.
Okay.
We know for sure that who he is, that he is the descendant of this Corpus family, and that he's been, his family's been Christian for 100 years at this point. I don't have anything of his besides.
No reference of him saying something to that account in the sermons?
No. I've given you the best bits of what I have about what he says.
Because I was struck by the fact that, again, as you just mentioned, and this was, you didn't mention in the talk, that it's, the organization according to the Parashot of Shavua is something striking. And of course, we remember how people like Nachmanides is extremely apprehensive about Dominican preaching in Barcelona at his time, because the Dominicans are assuming a line of attack or a line of sermonizing that is appealing in a way to the people that they are approaching. And it's interesting to see how his own comments on his conversion, on his sermons, are kind of, I'm banging my head against this wall and nothing is really happening. So it's interesting. Which leads me to another set of questions for Agnieszka. Two things that you mentioned were interesting to me. One has to do with the idea of the sick patient. It's very well known that the Society for the Promotion of Christianity Among the Jews, London Society, was very important in facilitating medical care for the Jews in Jerusalem. This building of the hospital still stands on Hennevein Street. Was there any of that happening in Poland as well? That's one question. The other question is the way you unpacked some of the information that you gave from how they conceive themselves and how they understand what they're doing brings forward a verification of the anxiety of Orthodox Jewish people towards these people. In other words, the pushback that Jews have against these missionaries comes exactly from what you were describing. We know from I'm familiar with what is going on in this country. Orthodox circles, early on, when they introduced themselves into this environment here in Palestine at the time, are extremely apprehensive of anything that has to do with the mission because of what you were describing. In other words, we want to be amicable, we want to approach these people, regardless of whether we will actually get them baptized, but we want to have them look at Christianity in a different angle. And of course, the pushback against that makes much more sense, given that this is the agenda.
As for your first question, there were medical missions in Poland, but it's a much later invention, mainly, beginning of the 20th century, and it was only in Lviv. As for the second question, I think the situation is more complicated in the Kingdom of Poland, because there were certain groups in the Jewish, first you have to remember that the Jewish society in Poland is getting more and more diverse in the 19th century, and you have different groups, sometimes very different from each other. So there are groups who, for various reasons, are interested in contacts with the missionaries, not exactly because they are interested in embracing Christianity, But for example, masculine in the Kingdom of Poland are talking to missionaries, because probably the missionaries are only educated Christians at this time in the Kingdom of Poland who are interested in talking to Jews. But of course, there is the majority of the Jewish population is at least skeptical, and the spectrum of responses towards the missionaries is really varied. You have interest, you have skepticism, you have the hostility, including physical hostility. So the spectrum is really broad.
I wanted to add one, I don't remember, in relation to something that you said just now, how he's perceived and his strategies. They're meant to be 2 conversionary preachers every week, and I didn't point that out because it wasn't relevant. One who is born Catholic and one who is a convert. We have records of all and the Catholic role goes to the Dominicans. We have records of almost all of the cradle Catholics, if you will. The records for the convert are much more spotty, but there's very much a sense that this is a good cop, bad cop routine, and that Jewish objections are much stronger to the convert preachers, and that their sermons are much more antagonistic. So that also affects his approach to preaching.
Two very quick questions. First of all, thanks to everybody for this excellent session. Emily, you mentioned how Ben-Gurion in his latest thoughts was looking back at the example of Stadler as kind of a very successful converter against his own experience. But surely he was aware of the huge difference of context. I wonder whether he reflects at any point about the fact that there was there had been a lot of violence before Stadler's career, and whether he thought about his own position in Rome as the one place where the Jews had not been expelled, as opposed to what had happened in the Catholic monarchy and the territories of Spain. So just that's the question for you.
Not that I found yet.
No, you haven't. So he
yet.
doesn't think about it.
No, it's a very passing and slightly strange reference to Vincent Ferrer. I was surprised there wasn't more about him, but I haven't seen it yet, if it's there.
Yeah, okay. So that was a question. And for Agda, my question was about whether your missionaries are at any point thinking that when they try to avoid doing too much, I mean, like basically they want God to be the job, it's God not their job, but they have to facilitate. Do they think about the Catholic missions as a counterexample of what to avoid? I mean, basically they have to draw lines, saying that's going too far, that's what we should do.
Thank you for this question. Well, the missions of the London Society were very anti-Catholic in its character, and I think the Catholic mission to the Jews were a perfect anti-example how to conduct missions to the Jews for them. And they very often juxtapose themselves towards the earlier missionary tradition. And they used this anti-papal, as they described it, tendency in their missionary activity very vividly. The problem was that their missions were carried out in the predominantly non-Catholic country. So there was a lot of not only religious but also political tension surrounding this activity in the Kingdom of Poland.
Can I just make just one follow-on thing here? Although interestingly, the things that they do when they go off with a recently converted Jew to go talk to the people they want to convert is exactly what the Jesuits do in Paraguay. So they very frequently take a recently converted indigenous person or a group of them to go ahead and begin to open up the conversation with potential converts, and then the Jesuit follows on, and exchange of gifts and all of these kinds of things in order to promote the conversation. So they're doing very, very similar kinds of things. I mean, I don't know whether they're aware of the history of the Catholic missions much earlier in time, but the similarity is quite striking.
My question was the question Jan-Paul was posing to Agnieszka, and then something else they already answered about. And the second part is there among the Jews, do you know if there is among the Jews a different attitude or a preference between Protestantism or Catholicism? Is any of the persuasion of Christianity less alien or less disagreeable? Do they prefer or do they show any preference for any of them? And then one for Emily. I was very interested in this question of, are Christians allowed to go into those sermons dedicated to Jews? I think this is an intriguing question that I have myself tried to see in my own sermons for Muslims in Spain. So the first question is, where are these sermons delivered? The man you are talking about, who I am so surprised because the Corcos are such an important Moroccan family. Still at that time they are still a very important Jewish family in Morocco. This is a footnote. So where are the sermons delivered, and how is it that they control if people who enters the space is Christian or not?
Sorry. Thank you very much for this remark. It's a very interesting question. I think the reasons why Jews very often were mistaken about the identity of the missionaries was that they were drastically different from what the Polish Jews
were used.
Were used to. And Catholics, or in more generally, Christians were associated with Avodah Zarah, with the idol worshipper in the Catholic piety, traditional Polish Catholic piety. So the Protestant missionaries left Jews very perplexed. They were not automatically identified as Christians. One of the rabbis who met missionaries and was surprised by the knowledge of Hebrew described them as Protestant Jews, whatever it meant. But it's a very interesting question, and I think missionaries used this as a strategy to approach Jews. This is what Emily mentioned about earlier, bad cop, a good cop policy. So they were saying basically, we are the good Christians. Do not look at your Catholic neighbors. They are not the true believers.
So they're delivered in an oratory. Most often it's the oratory of Santa Trinità dei Pellegrini, which is across from, you have to go over the tram tracks from the ghetto to get there. It's a Christian space, it's a neutral space, and it is well outside of the ghetto. It's a bit of a walk to get there. And it's chosen very deliberately because it is Christian, but not too sacred for Jewish bodies to be allowed in, because Jews aren't meant to be in churches. That is the place they most often take place, otherwise they take place in churches. As for knowing who goes in and what they are, this is the great era of distinguishing signs. So it's very clear who the Jews are because they're wearing their distinguishing signs. The catechumens and the neophytes are dressed in their catechumen and neophyte uniforms. There's a great description from Gregory Martin where he says, these guys are in white, these guys are in black, the Jews are here. And it's a big space. So everybody else coming in would be differentiated, would be a Christian. And then that would be differentiated by dress, by language. And the Jews are on a strict rota system by synagogue, who's supposed to send a delegation that week, and their names are ticked off at the door. So,
excuse me, by language?
Okay, I'm speculating on language, but I think that the Christians would be identified in part by the Italian that they spoke, I'm guessing. But also by very clearly not being distinguished as Jews, catechumens, or neophytes. and then also that the Jews would have been speaking Judeo-Romano, that the Christians would not have been. So it's pretty clear.
The question is actually for the four of you and maybe others here. The name of the panel is Tactics, and it gives the impression, maybe have the illusion, that it's something that the converters determine. But the fact of the matter is that when you start looking at it, it's actually, they determine sort of the rules of engagement, the way that they need to engage the people they want to convert. When you look at it, you see that actually, because conversion is sort of an interaction, a dialogue, it's very much determined by the side that's being converted, or no less by the side that's being converted. And here I want to ask a very general question. Do you think that when it's monotheistic religions with monotheistic religions, there's an emphasis on intellect, and whereas if it would be monotheistic religions towards pagans, it would be some other kind of an emphasis? Because, by the way, if you look at the plan of the conference, you'll see that this session is monotheistics with monotheistics, and the next panel, Tactics, is monotheistic with pagans. So I'm wondering, can we start looking at this general question and ask if there's something very different in the way that they engage their audience?
I'll be the first to head over the parapet. I basically would agree, with your thesis, and I would add in the case of my two Jesuits that along with the intellectual component is the theological anxiety of monotheism to monotheism. Say you're in some way connected with the Holy Roman Empire, and there's these Unitarians that have cropped up, and the word in the tavern is that maybe some of them are being influenced by Islam. So when you engage with Islam, it's not merely, well, I got to be an intellectual because they're people of a book and we have a book, but it's like this infection is insidious, and it may spread in port towns, and it may spread in prisons, and it's not some paganism from the middle of the Western Hemisphere that we can rope off and not regard as a secta. It is in fact a dangerous heresy. And that would all be expressed in intellectual terms as well. I think the two are interchangeable or interwoven.
Can I, however, disagree with the thesis? I think that engagement with Gentiles can be very intellectual. In the case of China and Japan, the whole thing with Buddhism is all about intellectual engagement, so I think it doesn't work. It depends entirely on which kinds of Gentiles we're talking about.
Yeah. Thank you for this interesting remark. And surely in the British missionary scene, the missions to the Jews were perceived as utterly intellectual missions. And one of the outcomes or side effects of this, on such a perception of missions to the Jews was, for example, that women were not engaged as active missionaries until late 20th century because of this intellectual character of the missions to the Jews, for which women were considered unfit for, according to the London Society, or generally the missionary standards. So the character of the missions to the Jews missions to the Jews as it was perceived by the London Society was purely intellectual.
Yes, intellectual. That's what my note says. Yes, intellectual. Yes, determined by audience. I will give you one example that sort of proves both of those, or demonstrates both of those, which is that there is a series of written protests by a later rabbi of the Roman community, Tranquilo Vitacocos the Younger, who responds to preachers who have gone out of line and have departed too far from what they are meant to say and have gotten too nasty in their preaching. And one of the things he says is, we are very similar peoples, my people and your people. We have all these things in common. This preacher is emphasizing the things that are different and making them look like much more of an exaggeration than they are. You shouldn't judge us by one outlying example in the same way that we shouldn't judge Christianity by Luther and Calvin. You wouldn't like that either. And then he says, we're not so different, right? You have confession, we have confession. You have 10 commandments, we have 10 commandments. The only thing that we differ on is this question of the Mashiach.
It's those,
Yeah.
it's very, very old.
Right, and I'm sure that he's well aware of these things. So I think that both the intellectual approach and the stressing of fundamental similarities is absolutely intrinsic to this whole history with Jews and Catholics in a way that is more flexible with other religions.
There was a question over there.
Hi, thank you for the fascinating session. I have a question for Emily also. I have a question that connects to other questions that already rise here. For the family legacy of the corpus, I ask. If you are giving any importance for the family, for the Jewish legacy of this family, and if you think it has connected to the passion he has when he is giving his sermons in order to convert other Jews.
How much does it matter to him that he is a Korkos?
Korkos, it's very, very noble family.
Yes.
So I think if you give him importance.
Right. So when the Korkos family converts, in the 1580s, I think, it is a very big deal. It shows up in the Avisi di Roma newsletters that get sent all over the world. It's used as testimony in the sanctity trial of Philip Neri, who is responsible for the conversion. It is attributed to sermons, although we know that it was Neri and not sermons. And it's this huge family. How much that affects him directly theologically, we don't know, because he was born into 2 generations of Catholics, and his family, his experience is not a Jewish experience. It remains, however, an extremely wealthy family, and that gives him some prominence. Even just the Catholic branch alone remains very wealthy. You saw his nice palace, or his family's palace. He rebuilt. We can see all the things that he does with the money that he inherits. So he comes in with a position of privilege that surely he knows comes from his Jewish past, but intellectually, he's not Jewish.
Thank you.
I gave you the permission to go a little bit longer with the session, so Professor Osman.
For Emily, you mentioned that it's difficult to separate utilitarian conversion from conviction conversion. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, why it's difficult to separate. And to Agnieszka, you said that many of the missionaries were former Jews. Could you give us examples of biographies of such people, what they went through in their life till they became missionaries? And for Paul, these translations are obviously for Christians. What about translations of the Bible for the Muslims by these same missionaries? Do we have such translations? And can you compare those translations to the translations of the Quran?
So conviction versus convenience is a long question when you're trying to understand the motives of converts, right?
Speak up, please.
Yeah. Is this all right? Okay, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So in an era, there we go. In an era where there's so much pressure to convert, and when there is so much concern for conversion, and we have so many cases of people who converted and then converted again and then converted again, there's a lot of doubt about motives for conversion, and then it's very difficult to get at those motives because you rarely get people talking explicitly about why they converted, and when they do, those stories have to fit into predetermined forms. and they have to conform to certain narratives, and it's very hard to unpack that. A lot of scholars have also argued for the idea that the most effective form of conversion is to basically persuade someone that a new lifestyle is easier than an old lifestyle or more attractive, and to make it very easy to switch. And I'm thinking particularly of a book of my colleague Andrew Pettigrew, Reformation and the Culture of Persuasion, in which you can't separate this is a good idea from this is a good life. And I think that many people in the room could contribute to this discussion. What I'm trying to do is to look at whether that is equally true for somebody on the side of, for an agent of conversion. And I think we do see it in this case, because here's somebody who is, on the one hand, very much bound by a set of constrictions, by very clear Catholic dogma that he has to follow and legislation that he has to follow, and who does not have has a great many forms he has to fit himself into, and who at the same time, and so he doesn't have, like, he may not have a lot of choice, but what I think he's also doing is making his lack of choice into his own choice, right? He's actively embracing it, questioning it, thinking about it, and infusing it with his own convictions by departing as much as he can, stay with new topics, but equally upholding the status quo and defending it as much as he can. I think that these two things are in a constant sort of fluctuation and balance and should not be seen as opposites, and I agree with Endelman on that front. That's all.
Thank you very much for this question, and taking into consideration biographies of various missionaries, I don't think I'm able to think about or talk about one typical background. The missionaries came from different walks of life, and their also family situation was very different. But I think the interesting thing connected to your question is that very often in the first half of the 19th century, when the missionaries are talking to the Jews, and Jews are some Jews are interested in or are considering changing their religion, they request to be missionaries after the baptism, and I think it's connected to the problem of some kind of a social degradation connected to conversion in the first half of the 19th century, contrary to the stereotypical understanding or stereotypical thinking about conversion as a social improvement associated more with a late 19th century conversion. What converts or potential converts are looking after the baptism is some kind of intellectual engagement, and they believe that doing other work than preaching, than being missionaries themselves, means practically for them a social degradation, for simply leaving this intellectual character of their life in the Jewish community and switching to book bindings or shoes making or whatever they found in their new life. So becoming a missionary, or this desire to engage in something intellectual, was present in many testimonies of converts or potential converts. Of course, not everyone was accepted later as a missionary. Thank you.
Thanks. You're right. These translations, at least at the highest conscious level, have Christian audiences in mind. At the end of the 1670s, a committee headed by Felipe Guadagnoli, who was not a Jesuit, but he was a Catholic cleric, produced a translation of the Bible into Arabic. Its overtly intended audience was Maronite Christians. It may have been exposed to, or Muslims may have been exposed to it, although I'm unaware of any clear documentation of that. One of the things that's notable about the 17th and early 18th century, it's a great period of Jesuit translation of catechisms and so on into all sorts of languages on many continents. This is really not a period when those sorts of things are happening aimed at Muslims. And even the sort of ad hoc reports in the annual letters and other documents where someone says, and Father Bernardo went out and told the stories of Jesus to Turks and so on. These are notably missing in the records that I've looked at. So this is a curious lacuna in this great period of Jesuit translation of Christian texts, and that's about all I can tell you about it.
Okay, thank you.
Ora.
Yeah.
Oh, please. I'm sorry.
I think we had a wonderful session, but while they are putting the food, I would like to share with you a small episode. As a student at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, interested in religion, Christianity, and so on, I took a lesson with the late Professor Flusser. It was a seminar about the Old Testament, and Flusser tried to convince us that Paul had it all wrong. But one morning, we were about 15 students in the class. Flusser, you must know, had a very theatrical persona. So one morning he came into the class very upset. He sat at me at the table, holding his head, saying, I had this nightmare tonight, that after my class, all of you go down to the Jordan and baptize yourself. So, and it is my fault. So please, before taking the exam, promise me you are not going to do it.